A couple of things.
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 Hi, welcome to today's episode of A Couple of Things. Today's episode is going to be a design episode, and I'll be talking about accessibility. I was originally going to talk about other sources of getting user feedback, but last week, I gave a talk about designing for accessibility and creating a more usable and accessible web, and decided to build up on that for the podcast today. So I hope you learned something new. So I'm going to start with what even is accessibility. Accessibility is basically addressing discrimination as it respects to creating user experiences that everyone can use, especially people with disabilities, making sure that whatever you're creating, people who have disabilities are not excluded from using that. So I won't be talking about the specific kinds of disabilities and how to design for them because there's a lot of resources out there and I'm not like an expert in that. I'll just talk more generally on things that I have been considering and things to consider when designing so that you can be more inclusive of everybody. Also, you can check out Praise UX's 10 minutes of UX podcast. She covered a bit about some kinds of disabilities and how to design for them. So, why is accessibility important? Accessibility is important because it means that everyone can use whatever it is that you have created. It means that it's a more inclusive world for everybody. So, imagine that there are 3.5 billion people in the world who could potentially use your products. That's like half of the world's population. And even if there's only 1% of those people, of the 3.5 billion people that have a form of disability, but they can't use your product, that's 35 million people that can't use your product. That's like half of the population of the UK that can't use your product. So if your product has 1 million users or 1 million potential users and 1% can't use it, that's 10,000 people, which is still a lot of people. And even if you want to think about, oh, I'm doing a business and a charity, people who have disabilities or who have extra, what quote unquote, extra needs also have money to spend on your business. So if you're technically excluding them, they can't spend money on your business. It's also important to know that people can have more than one form of disability, or what people can have non-physical disabilities like cognitive disabilities or quote unquote invisible disabilities. And this is something that people often forget to talk about when they're talking about designing for accessibility. People talk like as if, oh, yeah, either blind or deaf, right? You can have visual impairments and hearing impairments at the same time. So it's important to think about those kinds of cases as well. So accessibility is for everyone. Creating something that works for quote unquote edge cases makes it work for everyone. I'm sure that if you're a designer, you're most likely seeing that poster from Microsoft's inclusive toolkit of temporary, situational, and permanent disabilities. So if you design something so easy that people who have permanent disabilities can use it, then if somebody has a temporary or situational impairment, they're able to use it as well. So when you design for the quote unquote extreme or quote unquote edge cases, you're literally just designing for everybody to make it more easy for everybody to use. So, for example, something like alt text, it doesn't just help people with who have visual impairments. If there's poor network that the images can't load or for whatever reason images can't load on the website or an app or whatever, the user is also able to get that additional information using alt text, no matter like whether they have visual impairments or not. Which brings me to a form of accessibility that I don't hear a lot about or I haven't seen much about, which is what I'm calling. I don't know if there's anything out there about this, and I googled and didn't find anything, but I'm calling it technological inclusion and accessibility, and I'll delve into that after the pause, a break. So, what is this thing that I am calling technological inclusion and accessibility? Well, like I said, I haven't seen anything else out there, but if you see anything, please send my way so I can read out more on that and talk about it maybe in a future podcast episode. So, what I mean is, for example, in Nigeria, where most people use Androids and most of them use low end Androids, but in the tech and design space, iPhones and high end Androids are overrepresented. So, when people are building, they're usually building with those phones. So, instead of like what the larger population uses, who is probably going to end up using your product. So when that happens, you're not building a product that works for those kinds of people. You're only building a product that works for people like you. Also, think about like poor network. Can somebody who is struggling with 2G and 3G use your product successfully? Right. So some easy things that you can do to create more accessible products as a designer or a creator of digital products or anything else really is to literally put yourself in someone else's shoes. Do an accessibility audit. Try using your site or your product with only a screen reader or only your keyboard or only using 2G networks and see what that experience is like so that you can be more conscious of how you are designing and creating things for other people to use. Even think about like banks in Nigeria. If you want to go to a bank and you use a wheelchair, it's a very stressful process because those security doors are not made for people who use wheelchairs. So you need to think about that as well. It goes beyond just digital things and it's about everything around us. Another thing you can do is to find people, partner with people and organizations that connect with you to real people who have some form of disability and other that can test your products so that you're sure that even beyond the little things that you're doing on your own self, you're getting actual real feedback from people. So basically do real research with real people. If you're not sure where to start, you can start and search for common accessibility guidelines. Like Google Material Design has some resources on accessibility. Microsoft has an inclusive design kit, and there's the more popular web content accessibility guidelines, aka WCAG, which most people should be familiar with if you're a designer or a developer. You don't have to be a designer or a developer to be more conscious about web accessibility. And I'm actually trying to take my own advice. And so, for example, I'm working on getting the transcripts for each episode ready, and I will publish them in the coming days. I'm also being more conscious of adding alt text to my photos when I post to Twitter, Instagram, or add them to my Medium posts. So you can also do these things too and make the web more inclusive and more accessible for everybody.
Thank you for listening to today's episode. If this is your first time of listening to the podcast, please subscribe so that you don't miss out on future episodes. If you enjoyed listening, please share. Thank you. Bye.